The morning air carried that faint, salty bite of San Pedro Harbor. Gulls screeched over the industrial coastline while the sun peeked through a gauzy marine layer, casting a dull, gray light over the Superior Court of Los Angeles. Elaine Gutierrez stepped out of the rideshare car in a navy blue skirt suit that hadn't seen daylight since her husband's funeral. Clutching a leather binder like a lifeline, she paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps. From here, it all felt bigger than she imagined. Not the building, that was just standard municipal design, beige concrete and aging windows, but the feeling in her chest. Tense. Tight. After months of silence, of letters unanswered, of whispers behind her back at the business she once helped build, this was the day she would speak. Her heels clicked with quiet precision as she entered the building. No lawyer. No entourage. Just Elaine, 62 years old, widow, retired CPA, walking into a courtroom to face her stepson and his team of polished attorneys. Courtroom 5D wasn't full, but the few people inside were already seated. At the table to the left, Bradley Gutierrez sat confidently in a gray pinstripe suit, flanked by two attorneys and a young paralegal scrolling through documents on an iPad. He didn't even look up when Elaine entered. Of course he wouldn't. To him, she was already irrelevant. The bailiff nodded her toward the opposite table. No one stood with her. She placed her binder on the worn wooden surface, hands trembling slightly as she opened it to the first tab section, Original Shareholder Agreement, 1993, notarized. She could hear their whispers. Bradley was saying something to his lead attorney, a man named Thurston Wild, known for his scorched earth tactics in probate disputes. She heard Wild mutter, "Let her say whatever she wants, she doesn't even have standing." The judge entered. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marianne Lowenthal presiding. Everyone stood. Then Saturday Elaine looked up. Judge Lowenthal was in her late 50s, short-cropped silver hair, eyes sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. No smile. No welcome. Just the weight of the law behind every blink. "We are here today in the matter of Gutierrez Holdings versus Elaine Gutierrez, regarding claims to controlling ownership of the company and disputed documentation of shareholder rights." The clerk read. Judge Lowenthal turned to Bradley's table first. "Mr. Wild, does the petitioner have a motion before we begin?" "We do, Your Honor. A motion to dismiss on grounds that Ms. Gutierrez lacks legal standing. The company's records, audited financials, and incorporation paperwork show no active shareholder status or management involvement from the respondent in over 10 years. The judge turned to Elaine. "Ms. Gutierrez, do you have a response?" Elaine stood slowly. Her knees stiffened beneath her skirt, but her voice, to her own surprise, was steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I have documentation that will." Judge Lowenthal raised her hand. "Ms. Gutierrez, if this is just a rehash of speculative claims or undocumented memories, I must ask you not to waste the court's time." A soft snort came from Bradley's side. Elaine didn't flinch. Instead, she slid her binder forward and opened it with measured care. From a folder marked in blue ink, 1993, Founding Docs, she pulled a sealed manila envelope and held it out. "I believe this is relevant, Your Honor." The bailiff took the envelope and carried it to the bench. Elaine Saturday. Judge Lowenthal opened it, revealing 3 documents: a notarized shareholder agreement, a company formation letter signed by all 3 founding members, including Elaine's late husband, Javier Gutierrez, and a handwritten note on company letterhead stating that Elaine held 52% of the shares, placed in trust at the time of Javier's death. There was silence as the judge read. No one in the room moved. Bradley's eyes flicked toward the documents, then toward Elaine. For the first time, uncertainty cracked his perfect posture. After a long moment, Judge Lowenthal set the papers down. Her eyes met Elaine's, then drifted toward the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Wild," she said evenly, "are you aware of these documents?" Wild stood, hesitating. "Your Honor, this is the first we're seeing of them. They were not disclosed during discovery." Elaine spoke again, softer now. "They were sealed in my home safe. I submitted them last week to the court clerk's office for authentication. I have the submission receipt." Judge Lowenthal leaned back in her chair. "Then this case just became more complicated than your motion to dismiss suggests." A hush settled over the room. Elaine could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. She hadn't won. Not yet. But for the first time in months, the weight shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't crazy or senile or bitter. She was heard. The judge turned a page slowly. "Ms. Gutierrez, please be prepared to explain, under oath, how you obtained these documents and why they were not part of the corporate records." "Yes, Your Honor." The hearing was adjourned for a recess. As Elaine gathered her binder, Bradley finally looked at her. He didn't speak. He didn't smile, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. She wasn't supposed to matter, and now she did. Elaine walked out into the California sunlight. For the first time in months, her spine felt straighter. They had tried to erase her, but she still had the pen. The courthouse cafeteria was a sterile mix of linoleum, vending machines, and weary-looking attorneys hunched over overpriced salads. Elaine sat alone at a corner table, nursing a black coffee that tasted more like burnt paper than caffeine. The envelope now rested inside her purse, its presence a quiet reassurance. Still, her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for the lid. She wasn't shaking from nerves. It was the memory. It always came back when she least wanted it. The last time Bradley called her mom was in the ICU at St. Jude's, just 3 days before Javier died. Bradley had flown in from San Francisco, clean-shaven and clipped as always, his voice brisk, every word wrapped in businesslike concern. Elaine had been at the hospital for 10 straight days, sleeping upright in a recliner, managing Javier's meds, updating charts. Bradley walked in holding a tablet. He didn't hug her. He barely looked at her, but when the nurse stepped out and it was just the three of them, Javier unconscious, breathing shallowly, the machines beeping in lazy rhythm, Bradley leaned forward and said, "Mom, I know this is hard. But we need to talk about what happens next." Mom. The word caught her off guard. It had been years since he used it. Not since he was a senior at USC, before the company took off. Before he stopped coming to Sunday dinners. Before he started referring to her in public as my father's second wife. Elaine remembered the way he had said it that day, smooth, practiced, like a tool. And she remembered what followed: we should simplify the estate. Dad would have wanted that. Consolidate assets, streamline the holdings, transfer operational control to me. You're not in the filings anymore, not since you retired from the books. It's cleaner this way. At the time, she was too exhausted to fight. Too consumed with keeping Javier alive for one more day. She remembered nodding, not agreeing, but too foggy to challenge him. And Bradley had taken that silence and sprinted with it. After Javier's death, she expected grief. Instead, there were emails from the company's lawyers, cold letters requesting her signature to close remaining paperwork. Paperwork that, as it turned out, removed her entirely. She sipped her coffee now, eyes locked on a patch of sunlight stretching across the cafeteria floor. It flickered faintly as people passed her. Mind drifted further back. The first time she met Bradley, he was 12. Elaine had been dating Javier for only a few months, and he'd taken her to a community soccer game. Bradley had been thin, awkward, with 2 long limbs and a quiet curiosity in his eyes. She brought orange slices in a Tupperware container and sat with the other moms. He hadn't called her mom then, of course. Not for a long time. But she made his lunches, helped with math homework, drove him to SAT prep. She was the one who sat beside him at the DMV when he failed his first driving test and said, "You'll get it next time. Just breathe." Years later, when she and Javier co-founded G&G Tech Systems from their cramped garage in Long Beach, it was Elaine who handled the accounts, tracked expenses, filed taxes. Javier had vision. She had discipline. Bradley, freshly minted with a business degree, entered the picture when they hit their first $2 million in revenue, and slowly, he began rewriting the narrative: family-founded business, father and son. Venture, said the press release. Elaine's name appeared nowhere. She told herself it didn't matter. That it was Javier's dream, and that if Bradley wanted to carry it forward, maybe that was okay. Maybe her role was meant to be invisible, but invisibility had a cost. Back at the table now, Elaine reached into her purse and pulled out the second folder, not the original documents, but the timeline she had built. Every quarterly meeting she attended. Every tax form she filed. Copies of emails between her and the founding partners. Every piece of paper that proved she was there. Always, she looked at the pages. Her handwriting neat, deliberate. A woman trying to draw the map of how she disappeared. Across the room, she saw Bradley talking with Wild near the vending machine. He still stood like Javier, tall, shoulders back, but his smile was colder now. Tighter. He hadn't come over. Hadn't acknowledged her once since the recess began. He didn't need to. In his mind, the story had already been written. He was the heir. She was the afterthought. Elaine closed the folder gently. Let him believe that, let him keep underestimating her, because this time, she wasn't playing the supporting role. This time, she had the receipts. And a judge who had read them. Elaine always said memory wasn't about recollection, it was about records. She had learned that early in her career, back when she worked for a boutique tax firm off Wilshire Boulevard. Clients lied, books were doctored, and companies rose and fell not on their profits, but on their paperwork. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen, her mentor had told her on her first week. And so Elaine kept everything: invoices, minutes from meetings, emails, bank reconciliations, handwritten notes scrawled on post-its. She had drawers full of them, neatly organized in acid-free folders and color-coded by fiscal year. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. That mindset didn't change when G&G Tech Systems was born. Javier had the idea: custom modular systems for small manufacturing businesses. Affordable, flexible, scalable. He had two partners, both engineers, but neither had the head for numbers. Elaine stepped in to manage the books. Quietly. Without title or ceremony. At first it was just to help Javier, but by the third quarter, she was running payroll and prepping their filings with the IRS. Her name wasn't on the corporate charter. Not officially. But the agreement was clear, signed and notarized in the presence of a family friend who owned a notary shop in Echo Park. Javier wanted her to be safe, to be protected if anything happened. 52% held in trust, with rights to revert to her upon his passing, and because Elaine was Elaine, she kept everything. Now, sitting at her dining room table that night after the court recess, she opened one of the heavy file boxes she had retrieved from storage. Her small apartment in Long Beach was spotless, but tonight it felt crowded by the past. The box gave off a faint smell of old ink and dry paper. She lifted out a thick binder labeled 2006 to 2010, internal reports plus memo exchanges. She flipped to a section marked Bradley onboarding, initial access requests. There it was, a printout of the email where she had added Bradley to the internal finance system. A request he had made at the time with a note that said, "Thanks, Mom, I just need to poke around." The email was signed, dated, and sent through the official company server. On its own, it meant nothing, but in court, it proved he once saw her as part of the foundation, not an outsider. Elaine pulled out another sheet, a handwritten note from Javier on G&G letterhead, dated 1997, referencing an equity adjustment in her favor after a major client contract. She remembered that client, Allwyn Plastics in Fontana. They had delivered the pitch together, her nervous and heels too tight, Javier charming but forgetful. She'd remembered the numbers in the meeting. Saved the deal. That letter, written in Javier's broad, looping script, said it plainly: Elaine deserves the full stake we discussed. She's the reason we made it through those first 5 years. Notarized? No. But signed. On company paper. The letterhead still had the old logo, a stylized G inside a gear. She added it to the new binder, exhibit set, trial phase 1. Every page she touched was a stitch. A thread reinforcing the tapestry of her presence. Years of being quiet, of being modest, of stepping back so others could shine, now gathered, arranged, and ready to be seen. She paused at a picture tucked in the back of one of the binders. A Polaroid, faded and grainy. Her, Javier, and Bradley standing in front of their first office space, a converted auto shop in Carson. She remembered the day. The way Javier had insisted on the photo even though the place smelled like oil and dust. Elaine had been wearing a blazer she'd bought at a discount outlet, thinking maybe she'd start dressing more executive. Bradley was smiling. Genuinely. Arms slung across her shoulder. They had been a family then. Now he acted like she was nothing more than a footnote. A woman who clung to old paper because she didn't understand how things really worked. She closed the binder slowly and labeled the spine with black marker, ownership evidence, 1993-2015. That would be enough for now. As she turned off the dining room light and walked toward her bedroom, Elaine felt the subtle weight of the day finally sink in. But it didn't break her. She wasn't angry. Not in the way people expected. She was something sharper. Steadier. She had lived her life building systems. Systems that others relied on. Systems that others forgot. But now, those same systems, the ones they dismissed as clerical, would become her armor. Let wild posture, let Bradley smirk, let the judge decide. Elaine would be ready. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the day after the hearing recess, Thurston Wilde arrived at his office, a corner suite in Century City Tower with views of smog-choked freeways and distant Hollywood Hills. He didn't care much for the view. It was a selling point for clients, not for him. What mattered was what happened in the conference rooms: control, perception, timing. He poured his first espresso shot of the morning, no milk, no sugar, and pulled up the scanned copies of Elaine Gutierrez's documents on his monitor. They were authentic. That much was clear. The court clerk's office had already verified the notarization stamps, and the judge had requested both parties prepare for evidentiary hearings. Wilde stared at the 1993 shareholder agreement, his jaw tight. It wasn't just damaging. It was foundational. This wasn't some disgruntled widow trying to claw back relevance. This was someone with actual equity, someone who'd been underestimated. He didn't like surprises. Especially not ones that changed the ground he thought he was standing on. Behind him, his junior associate, Karina Patel, entered carrying a tablet and a hard copy of their updated trial brief. She was smart, top of her class at Stanford, and pragmatic. The kind of attorney who read every footnote. Morning, Thurston. You see the envelope she submitted? He didn't answer. Just gestured to the screen. Karina nodded. Authentic. Which means our motion to dismiss is dead. Judge Lowenthal will want a full hearing. Wilde took a slow sip of espresso. She played this well. Quiet until she had leverage. Never gave us a preview during discovery. She was pro-SE, Karina said. We underestimated her. Most people would have crumbled under pressure yesterday, especially after that interruption from the judge. But she didn't. She came armed. Wilde hated losing control of a narrative. Tell me about the husband, he said. Javier Gutierrez. What else do we know? Karina tapped her tablet. Co-founder of G&G Tech Systems. Elaine was his second wife. Married 26 years. He died 5 years ago from complications related to pancreatic cancer. Left behind a business worth roughly $12 million at the time. No will. No will, Wilde repeated, leaning back. Sloppy. Very. Probate was chaotic. Bradley stepped in with power of attorney that expired at death but kept acting like he had executive control. The company restructured its internal filings, removed Elaine as an active shareholder, citing her retirement 5 years earlier. And we backed that argument, Wilde said. Built the motion to dismiss on the assumption she had no legal standing. That assumption, Karina said carefully, is now broken. Wilde pinched the bridge of his nose. This wasn't about law anymore, this was about optics. A seasoned woman, calm under pressure, presenting original, notarized documents while his client looked like he'd just seen a ghost. The judge wasn't going to forget that moment. We need to go on offense, he muttered. Start pushing. The idea that she's manipulative. Maybe even forge a narrative that she exploited Javier in his final years. Impaired cognition, undue influence. Karina frowned slightly. That's a tough sell. Elaine's never touched $1 since his death. Lives in a modest apartment. Her financial records show no withdrawals from company accounts. She hasn't profited. If anything, she's behaved like someone who stepped away voluntarily. Wilde stared out the window. Voluntarily, or was she pushed? Karina shrugged. That might be the question the judge ends up asking. He turned back to his desk and pulled up the press release Bradley had issued after the restructuring, family-led growth, father-son vision moving forward. No mention of Elaine. Not even a thank you. Wilde had worked enough inheritance cases to know how perception worked in courtrooms. Judges responded to stories. Fairness. Human intuition. If Elaine got to keep positioning herself as the quiet, forgotten partner, the invisible hand behind the business, she'd win the courtroom without even needing a lawyer. He swiveled his chair. Schedule a meeting with Bradley, he said. In person. Today. Karina hesitated. You think he'll listen? He better. 2 hours later, in a private glass-walled conference room, Bradley Gutierrez arrived 20 minutes late and visibly irritated. He didn't sit. What the hell happened yesterday? He asked, pacing. Wilde didn't sugarcoat it. She had documentation. Original agreements. Signatures. Shareholder majority on paper. Bradley stopped. My dad revoked that before he died. He told me. Wilde cut him off. But he didn't write it. And that's all that matters now. There was a beat of silence. Bradley sat. Jaw tight. So what do? We control the narrative, Wilde said. We reframe her as someone who let go of her responsibilities years ago. Voluntary abandonment. We imply she resurfaced now because of money. She doesn't care about money, Bradley muttered. Then we make the court believe she does. Bradley looked away, jaw tightening. This company is mine. It's not about what you believe, Wilde said coolly. It's about what we can prove, and what we can undermine. The room went silent. For the first time, Bradley looked uncertain. His confidence, usually unshakable, had fractured. She's not the same woman, he finally said. She's different now. Wilde smiled faintly. Yes. She's dangerous now. The reception desk at G&G Tech Systems looked like something out of a Silicon Valley brochure. Glass, brushed steel, warm LED backlighting. A wall-sized screen rotated through looping images of factory automation, logistics flowcharts, and the words, "We build smarter systems." Elaine stood just inside the entrance, momentarily dwarfed by the sleekness of it all. She hadn't been here in almost 6 years, not since Javier's memorial service, when Bradley had staged a press event in the front lobby, complete with podium, floral arrangements, and a commemorative plaque. She remembered watching from the back, unnoticed. Unacknowledged. Now she was back, invited by court order for a site verification visit as part of pretrial evidence review. Her presence was legally mandated, but clearly unwelcome. Mrs. Gutierrez, said a thin voice from behind the desk. The receptionist, a young woman in her 20s with perfect eyeliner and an apologetic smile, stood. I'm Jenna. Mr. Gutierrez said to have someone from facilities escort you. Elaine nodded politely. That won't be necessary. I know my way around. Jenna hesitated, then picked up the phone. Elaine walked past before she could hear the whisper that would inevitably follow. She's already walking in. The hallway lighting was different now, cooler, motion-triggered, but the bones were the same. The main corridor still curved slightly left, leading to the original operations office. She moved slowly, letting her heels echo in defiance. The first thing she noticed was the wall where the founder's timeline used to be. Years ago, she'd helped design it, a gallery of framed photos showing the company's evolution from garage startup to industrial partner. She had personally selected a photo from 1995, her, Javier, and the two engineers standing in front of their first delivery truck. Now the wall was gone. Replaced by a backlit mission statement etched into plexiglass, a family vision since day one. No pictures. No names. No. Elaine stopped in front of the R&D glass wing. Inside, a team of 6 engineers were gathered around a whiteboard, mid-brainstorm. She knew none of them. But the layout of the workspaces, modular desks, the exact dimensions between stations, the dual monitor setup, was her design. She'd planned it with Javier in facilities back in 2008 to improve line of sight and reduce walk time between terminals. She had the blueprint at home. Still folded neatly in her storage box, she continued down the hall and reached the accounting department, a room she had once ruled with quiet order and 4-color pens. The current head accountant, a man named Daryl who'd been hired after her retirement, looked up in surprise as she passed the glass window. Elaine caught a glimpse of the spreadsheets on his screen, still using the custom reconciliation template she'd built in Excel. Elaine almost smiled. The break room was where it hit her hardest. The microwave was new. So were the chairs. But the poster pinned to the bulletin board, faded and slightly curled at the corners, was hers. Don't fudge the numbers, they always leave fingerprints. Elaine G. She stopped walking. Stared at it. Somewhere along the way, they had tried to erase her, but her fingerprints were everywhere. Footsteps echoed behind her. Bradley. He looked annoyed, holding his phone and walking fast. You're not supposed to wander. There was supposed to be a facilities escort. I built this floor plan, Elaine said, still facing the bulletin board. I'm more familiar with it than anyone you've hired in the past decade. That doesn't entitle you to wander like a tourist, he snapped. She turned to face him. There he was, the same boy who used to sit cross-legged in her living room, building Lego cities with Javier. But now the lines around his eyes were sharper, his jaw clenched tighter. The warmth she once tried to preserve in him had calcified into something harder. I'm not a tourist, Elaine said quietly. I'm the reason this place exists. Bradley scoffed. You were a bookkeeper. A helper. My dad was the engine. And I was the foundation, she said, their eyes locked. A silent, dangerous beat. Finally, Bradley spoke, quieter now. You had your chance to be involved. You retired. I stopped getting invited, she corrected. And when I asked questions, you started locking the books. I have the emails. Bradley looked away for a second, jaw tightening. This is a business, Elaine. Not a charity. Not a family reunion. The company grew because I pushed it. I modernized it. And erased me in the process, she said. He stepped forward. You want money? Fine. Let's settle. Quietly. I can authorize something fair. Elaine tilted her head slightly. You think I want a payout? There was a silence. She shook her head. I want the record corrected. A long beat, then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the lobby. Bradley watched her go, arms crossed, chest rising fast. When she reached the glass doors, she paused and looked up once more at the wall where the founder's timeline used to be. The plexiglass mission statement shimmered under the ceiling lights. She didn't belong in it, not yet, but if she had her way, if truth mattered at all, they'd have to carve her name into that wall, and this time, they wouldn't be able to take it down. The conference room was too cold, intentionally, Elaine suspected. A long, rectangular space inside Wild & Associates' downtown office tower, lined with chrome fixtures, a carafe of untouched water, and a camera mounted in the corner for official video recording. Elaine sat at one end of the polished oak table. In front of her was a small microphone, a notepad she hadn't written on, and the original binder she'd brought to court, now tagged with pastel sticky notes. A court reporter clicked away behind a steno machine, her hands moving like a pianist's. Across the table sat Bradley, flanked by his legal team, Thurston Wilde, stern and composed in a navy suit, and Karina Patel, silent but observant, eyes scanning everything. Bradley looked restless, tapping his pen against the table, trying not to look at Elaine. The court reporter's voice broke the tension. This deposition is being recorded as part of pretrial proceedings in Gutierrez Holdings versus Elaine Gutierrez. Deposition begins at 9:02 a.m. Please state your full name for the record. Elaine leaned forward. Elaine Marisol Gutierrez. Wilde wasted no time. Mrs. Gutierrez, let's begin with something simple. You claim to own 52% of G&G Tech Systems. Why did you wait nearly 5 years after your husband's death to assert your ownership? Elaine didn't blink. Because I trusted the people in charge. I believed that my role in the company was known, respected, and that my documentation was secure. I didn't expect to be erased. Wilde raised an eyebrow. You didn't suspect? Not even when your name was removed from official documents. I was told by Bradley and the company's lawyers that I had no current involvement and that everything was being restructured for efficiency. I believed, wrongly, that I would be consulted. Karina scribbled a note, and you didn't contest this legally at the time? Wilde continued, no. I was grieving. And trusting. 2 conditions that don't mix well with business. Wilde leaned forward. Are you saying you had no understanding of the legal consequences of signing off on your removal? Elaine reached for the binder. I didn't sign anything that removed me. I have copies of every form I signed. None of them cede ownership. In fact, she flipped to a tabbed page. This document, dated August 12, 2018, is a company update I received that still lists me as a majority shareholder. It was emailed to me directly from the CFO at the time. Karina looked up. Wilde paused. Bradley exhaled sharply. That document was sent by mistake. We amended it. Elaine's tone sharpened, but never rose. Then the mistake was in continuing to recognize my ownership years after my so-called retirement. Wilde tried a new angle. Let's talk about involvement. Can you point to any operational activity you engaged in during the 5 years leading up to Javier's death? Elaine opened another tab. Payroll approvals, 2014 through 2016. I personally approved vendor contracts, submitted quarterly tax filings, and reviewed the company's audit from Dorsey and Lane in 2015. Here are my signature pages. She laid them out, one by one. You kept these all this time? Wilde asked, trying to mask his irritation. I'm an accountant, she said. That's what we do. Karina smiled faintly. The first crack in the opposing wall. Wilde shifted. Tactics again. Mrs. Gutierrez, you were not listed in any board meeting minutes after 2017. How do you explain that? I stopped being invited, she replied simply. But absence from a meeting doesn't revoke ownership. Shareholders can be excluded. That doesn't make it legal. Wilde narrowed his eyes. You're not an attorney. No, she said. But I've worked with lawyers for 30 years. Including the one who wrote our original shareholder agreement. That landed. Bradley finally spoke. She's twisting this. You stepped away, Elaine. You disappeared. Elaine looked at him calmly. I stopped being welcome, Bradley. Not involved. He laughed bitterly. You don't know what it takes to run a company at this scale. Elaine raised an eyebrow. You're right. I only built it. Silence. The court reporter looked up. Please let the witness finish before responding. Wilde leaned back, clearly recalibrating. Final question for now, he said, voice tight. What exactly do you want from this lawsuit? Elaine's answer came without hesitation. I want the court to affirm what was already true, that I am the majority owner of G&G Tech Systems. That I was never lawfully removed. And that my role in its founding, development, and success be restored in both legal and public record. She looked across the table at Bradley. I want my name put back where it belonged. Not as a gesture, but as fact. Wilde stood. We'll take a break. The deposition paused. Elaine closed her binder and took a slow breath. Across the table, Bradley avoided her gaze. He was no longer leaning back with that smug ease he carried into every room. For the first time, she could see it, the possibility that he might lose. She wasn't just an obstacle anymore, she was a witness. A record. A reckoning, and the court would soon hear everything. The envelope had been resting at the back of the filing cabinet for years. It was an old, navy blue expanding folder, the kind lawyers used in the 90s, with a worn brass clasp and faint smudges from fingers long gone. Elaine had nearly forgotten about it. Tucked behind a row of labeled binders in Javier's home office, beneath a plastic sleeve of old business cards and tax certificates, she hadn't touched the drawer since he died, not because she didn't know what was inside, but because she did. And because opening it meant facing both the grief she kept compartmentalized and the decisions they had made during those last, foggy weeks. It had been 2.5 years since his death when she finally opened it. That morning, the house was quiet. No ringing phones. No client calls. Just the slow creak of drawers and the rustle of papers as she sorted through memories. She had decided to downsize, to leave the house in San Pedro that had become too big and too empty. That was when she found it. The envelope was labeled in Javier's handwriting, contingency. Read carefully. JG. She sat down at the edge of his old leather office chair, the familiar groan of its springs echoing through the room. She opened the clasp, hand steady despite the slight tremble in her breath. Inside, 5 documents. All originals. All signed. All dated. The notarized shareholder agreement from 1993, listing Elaine as the majority holder with 52% ownership, signed by all 3 founders. A trust letter Javier had written just months before his diagnosis, reaffirming her share in the company and instructing that no decisions regarding its structure be made without her written consent. A letter of intent addressed to the board, never sent, stating his wishes for Elaine to retain operational veto power if anything were to happen to him. A copy of her original accounting system schematic, with his handwritten annotation in the corner, still the cleanest system we ever used. Don't change it. And finally, a note, written in Javier's familiar, looping cursive, Elaine, if you're reading this, it means I didn't finish everything I planned to. I should have filed a new will. I should have clarified things better. But I thought there would be time. There never is. You built this company with me. Every long night. Every audit. Every near collapse. I couldn't have done it without you. If Bradley forgets that, remind him. And if anyone else tries to erase you, remind them too. It's yours. Javier. Elaine sat motionless, the paper soft and warm in her hands, as if the ink itself still remembered his grip. She didn't cry. Not then, she just nodded. Once. As if acknowledging a debt being called in for years after his death, she'd avoided confrontation. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Grief had no boundaries, it blurred judgment, dulled instincts, shrank people. She let Bradley take over because he was her husband's son, because he carried Javier's last name, because family had to mean something, but that envelope, that signature, changed everything. It wasn't just sentiment. It was structure. Legal, provable, irrevocable structure. Still, she didn't file the documents right away. She waited. Watched. Gave Bradley every opportunity to do the right thing. To acknowledge her. To even so much as thank her. He never did. In the end, it wasn't the erasure that pushed her. It was the way they rewrote history, turning her into a footnote while parading around the idea that the company had always been just a father and son venture. That she had been some benevolent bookkeeper, retired and irrelevant. The irony, of course, was that the one thing Bradley never understood, the thing Javier always admired, was that Elaine never spoke until she had the paper in hand. She didn't threaten, she documented, she didn't protest, she filed, and now, with that envelope submitted into court record and her deposition complete, the next phase was inevitable. She remembered something else Javier used to say when they first started the business, back when their office was still the kitchen table. The signature isn't what makes it real, it's the silence that follows. If no one challenges it, it becomes truth. But this time, someone had challenged it. So Elaine had responded, not with anger. Not with vengeance, but with paper. Elaine wasn't looking for it. Not exactly. After the deposition, her lawyer friend Marta, retired now, living up in Santa Rosa, had called her. They used to work together in the early 2000s on corporate tax cases. Marta had followed the hearing in the local legal bulletins and left a message that simply said, "They're going to dig into everything now. So should you." It wasn't a warning. It was advice, and Elaine, being Elaine, took it seriously. She pulled out her external hard drives, 4 of them, labeled by year, and reloaded old accounting files onto her laptop. Not because she expected to find a smoking gun, but because clarity was power. The trial wasn't just about the past, it was about pattern. About credibility. About proving not only that she had always been involved, but that her absence had changed the company for the worse. She started with the 2016 ledgers, the year she unofficially stepped back. What she noticed wasn't immediate, it was subtle, like a seam off by half a stitch. Vendor payments were being routed through a holding company she didn't recognize, MDK Solutions LLC. The name wasn't in the original vendor registry. She checked again. Found 5 disbursements, each under $9,000, small enough to avoid internal flags, but frequent enough to matter. They were logged as consulting fees. Elaine knew every consultant they'd ever hired. She'd written most of the contracts herself. She dug deeper. By Q1 2017, those disbursements increased, now 2 per month, each exactly $8,950, with vague line items like strategic review or market research. The pattern was too neat. Too deliberate. Someone was keeping payments below the $10,000 threshold that triggered internal audit oversight. That someone, she suspected, was Bradley, but suspicions weren't evidence. She cross-referenced the vendor address listed on the MDK invoices. It belonged to a P.O. box in Torrance. She paid for a reverse business lookup. The registered agent for MDK Solutions LLC, Cara Mendez, Bradley's college girlfriend. A name Elaine hadn't heard in over a decade. It wasn't illegal for the company to hire a third-party vendor. But it was illegal to conceal self-dealing. If Bradley had ownership in MDK or was routing funds to personal contacts without board approval, it was a violation of fiduciary duty. And with Elaine holding 52% ownership, those approvals were supposed to include her. She printed everything. Created a side binder, MDK transactions, 2016 to 2020. But she wasn't done. She wanted confirmation. Elaine reached out to someone who still worked at G&G, a quiet voice from the accounting department, someone she had trained years ago. Her name was Danielle, and she still remembered the color coding system Elaine had taught her. They met at a small diner near Harbor City, just after closing time. I shouldn't even be here, Danielle said, looking around nervously. Bradley's team's already started freezing admin access. They're paranoid. Elaine slid the MDK reports across the booth. Do you recognize these? Danielle stared. Her eyes widened. Those were flagged during a routine review. I remember. I brought them to Daryl, the new controller, and he said to drop it. Said they were authorized at the executive level. Did you see any contracts? No. Just invoices. Always under 10 grand. Elaine nodded. Have any payments continued in the past year? Danielle hesitated. Then pulled out her phone and typed quickly. After a few moments, she turned the screen toward Elaine. A recent line item, MDK Solutions, invoice number 0874, $8,950, description, growth consulting. Dated 3 months ago. Elaine sat back. The pattern hadn't stopped. It was still happening. She thanked Danielle and paid for their coffee. As she stepped into the cool night air, the realization hit her like a tide. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about fraud, and in California corporate law, self-dealing by executives, especially when concealed from majority shareholders, could lead to civil penalties, board removal, and even criminal investigation. She had the documents, the vendor trail, the silent witness, all tied to Bradley. For months, he had argued that Elaine's claim to the company was sentimental. That she didn't understand how modern business worked. That she had left the table willingly, but he didn't expect her to come back with records, and he never expected her to come back with leverage. The boardroom hadn't changed much, still lined with smoked glass windows. Still dominated by the long walnut table with sleek ergonomic chairs. Still the same ambient scent of polished wood and faint citrus from the cleaning crew that arrived before dawn. Elaine sat at the far end now, the seat once reserved for Javier. The one she used to avoid. This time, she claimed it.to her right sat Kenneth Duvall, an original investor and silent partner for years. To her left, Susan Leung, Director of Operations, who had taken over much of the day-to-day running of G&G Tech Systems. Neither had spoken much since the meeting was called, an emergency shareholder review, per Clause 7.1 of the original agreement. Bradley entered 10 minutes late. He carried himself with the brittle confidence of someone who had practiced the performance in front of a mirror, perfect tie knot, firm stride, no eye contact with Elaine. Behind him came Thurston Wilde, silent and visibly irritated, and a junior associate with a briefcase full of papers that would soon be obsolete. Elaine didn't rise when they entered. She simply nodded at the board secretary seated against the wall, who hit record on the digital audio device. Then she opened her folder, revealing a neat stack of documents, marked with yellow tabs. I appreciate you all making time for this meeting, she said, voice calm, even. As the majority shareholder of G&G Tech Systems, I've called this, under provision of our founding agreement, to present evidence of fiduciary misconduct within the company's executive branch. Bradley's mouth opened. Wilde reached over and gently touched his sleeve. Don't speak yet, Elaine continued. In the course of preparing for the ongoing civil litigation regarding my ownership, I reviewed historical financial data and uncovered a recurring pattern of vendor payments to an entity named MDK Solutions LLC, a company not disclosed to the board, nor listed in the approved vendor registry. She passed out the first packet. Each payment was under $10,000. Routine enough to avoid audit flags. However, the LLC is registered to Cara Mendez, a known personal associate of Bradley Gutierrez. Bradley scoffed. You can't be serious. Wilde whispered sharply, let her finish. Elaine didn't pause. She handed out the next page, a printed summary of payments from 2016 to 2024, totaling $431,750, nearly $500,000. In unapproved payments routed through a private shell company, with no evidence of services rendered. This constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. She turned to Kenneth Duvall, who had leaned forward, reading. I believe Mr. Duvall will recall that as part of our original bylaws, the board must be informed of any third-party engagements that exceed a cumulative threshold of $50,000 within a fiscal year. Duvall nodded slowly. Correct. Elaine laid out the final sheet, a sworn affidavit from Danielle Romero, a current G&G accountant, stating that she raised concerns internally and was instructed to drop it. Ladies and gentlemen, Elaine said, locking eyes with each board member in turn, this is not just about disputed ownership anymore. This is about corporate misconduct. And as majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to demand immediate suspension of Bradley Gutierrez from executive duties, pending a full forensic audit. The room froze. Wild leaned forward. This is a power play. Elaine turned toward him. No. This is accountability. Something that's been missing since Javier's death. Bradley laughed, but the sound was hollow. You think this is going to stick? Elaine stood slowly. I think that when the audit begins, they'll find more than just MDK. I think your arrogance left a trail. And I think the board has just been waiting for someone, anyone, to say what we all know. She looked at Susan Leung. Susan had been quiet, but her expression had shifted, no longer cautious, now clearly watching Bradley with narrowed eyes. Duval cleared his throat. A vote is in order. Bradley stood abruptly. You're not voting on this. We are, Duval said, voice firm. Elaine has met the threshold for cause. Wilde began to protest, but the board secretary cut in, with the majority shareholder present, her vote alone triggers the action. Elaine looked directly at Bradley as she said it. I vote to suspend Bradley Gutierrez from executive authority, effective immediately. Susan Leung raised her hand next. Seconded. Duval followed. Third. 3 voices. One decision. Bradley's face went slack. Elaine gathered her documents calmly as security was called in to escort Bradley from the building. He didn't fight. Didn't speak. Just stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the woman who used to cut his apple slices and fix his resume typos, but as the person now holding the keys. He had thought she was finished. She wasn't. She never had been. As the door closed behind him, Elaine remained standing, not triumphant, just centered. She hadn't sought revenge. Only clarity. And now, for the first time in years, the record began to align with the truth, her truth, and it had just become the company's truth too. The article dropped 3 days after the boardroom vote. Bradley Gutierrez suspended from G&G Tech Systems amid allegations of financial misconduct. Byline, Lauren Cho, Business Affairs Desk, The Los Angeles Herald. Elaine read it alone, early in the morning, in her quiet apartment with a half-drunk cup of chamomile cooling on the windowsill. Her phone had already started buzzing by the time she reached the second paragraph. Sources close to the company confirmed that Elaine Gutierrez, widow of co-founder Javier Gutierrez, led the motion to suspend her stepson during an emergency shareholder meeting this week. Court documents filed earlier this month suggest Elaine may hold majority ownership in the company, a claim previously dismissed but now substantiated by notarized founding documents. Her name was in print, not as a background figure, not as widow or family representative, but as a central actor. The woman who'd returned with receipts. She had expected the story to leak. Wilde had threatened as much during the last deposition, hoping public scrutiny might scare her into silence. But instead, it had only widened the stage, and now, reporters wanted more. Lauren Cho herself had left 2 voicemails and a polite email request for an interview. Elaine hadn't answered. Not yet. She spent the day in the rhythm of avoidance, watering plants, reading old journals, filing court forms, anything to delay what she knew was coming. By late afternoon, the story had spread. Social media buzzed with fragments. Businesswoman reclaims ownership after being written out by stepson. Silent founder emerges with documents that reshape company's legacy. A woman underestimated, until she wasn't. One post in particular caught her eye. A still frame from the courtroom, taken during a public hearing the previous week, her standing, holding the shareholder agreement, just before handing it to the judge. The caption read, "Don't waste the court's time," the judge said. She didn't. She changed it. Thousands of likes. Dozens of shares. People drawn not to the business mechanics, but to something deeper, a woman who had stayed quiet too long, and then returned with proof. Still, Elaine hesitated. She had never wanted a spotlight. That was Javier's role, and later, Bradley's. She was the one who made things work behind the scenes, who double-checked numbers, made payroll at 2 a.m., took calls from vendors in the middle of dinner. She had built the structure others stood on. And now the public wanted her voice. By nightfall, she called Marta. Her friend answered on the second ring. "I figured I'd hear from you today. They want an interview. You thinking of saying yes?" Elaine leaned against the kitchen counter. "I don't know. I'm not a headline. I'm not a moment." "No," Marta said gently. "You're a legacy. But if you don't tell your story, someone else will, and they'll tell it wrong." Elaine was silent. Marta added, "This isn't about ego, Elle. This is about truth. For women who've been written out, overlooked, pushed aside. You're not just proving a point in court anymore. You're showing people what quiet strength looks like. That landed. Elaine hung up shortly after. She didn't respond to the email that night. She didn't need to rush. The moment would still be there in the morning. Instead, she pulled an old photo album from her bookshelf, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside, faded pictures from the early days of the company. Her and Javier standing in front of a chalkboard covered in scribbles. The first company check, pinned to a corkboard. A birthday party in the break room where she was the only one not in the frame because she was taking the picture. For a long time, she thought that being behind the camera, behind the spreadsheet, the decision, the signature, meant she didn't matter. Now, she knew better. Visibility didn't define value, but sometimes, being seen helped others realize theirs. The next morning, Elaine opened her email. Subject, interview request, the LA Herald. She replied, Dear Ms. Cho, I've decided I'm ready to speak. Let me know when you're available. Warm regards, Elaine M. Gutierrez. She hit send, not to make noise, but to set the record straight. The courtroom was full, not just with lawyers, clerks, and officials, but with people. Some from the company. Some from the press. A few who simply wanted to watch something real unfold. Elaine sat at the witness table, back straight, hair pulled into a soft bun, her hands gently folded in front of her. She wore a gray blazer Javier had once complimented, saying it made her look like someone who should be on a dollar bill. A quiet nod to memory. To intention, Judge Marianne Lowenthal presided. With the same firm calm as before. The case had evolved, from a probate dispute to a corporate reckoning, and the courtroom now felt heavier with significance. Bradley sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by what remained of his legal team. Wilde was still there, though. Less sharp than before, his tone dulled by weeks of slow unraveling. A new associate handled the files. Bradley looked thinner. Tired. Elaine looked the same. If anything, steadier. The clerk called her name. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. She Saturday. Wilde stood first. Mrs. Gutierrez, he began, you've claimed majority ownership in G&G Tech Systems, yet you did not participate in executive decisions for nearly 5 years. Why? Elaine's voice was calm, firm. Because, after my husband's death, I was systematically excluded. My access to financial systems was revoked. Invitations to board meetings stopped. I asked why. I was told, things are changing. But you didn't contest this. Not at the time. I was grieving, she said simply. And I didn't expect to be pushed out of something I helped build. Wilde paced. You say you helped build the company. But can you cite a specific contribution, something beyond bookkeeping? Elaine didn't flinch. I designed the company's original pricing model. I negotiated the first vendor contracts. I created the system for scaling custom packages based on client output, the same system still used today, under a different interface. You have documentation of that? I do. She reached for a binder and flipped to a tab marked 1997, Pricing Algorithm Notes. Wilde hesitated. Let's move on. The courtroom stirred faintly. He shifted tactics. Isn't it true, Mrs. Gutierrez, that you and Mr. Gutierrez never updated the shareholder agreement after 1993? That's correct, Elaine said. Because we never needed to. I remained the majority shareholder, and no board vote challenged that. But your name wasn't on the public filings. No, she said. Because public filings are operational. Ownership is determined by signed and notarized agreements. Which I have. He paused, then held up a document. This letter, written by your husband, but never filed or notarized, expresses an intent to leave you the company. Isn't that circumstantial at best? Elaine looked at it. Yes. But the shareholder agreement is not. Nor is the trust letter reaffirming my 52% ownership. Nor is the pattern of my documented involvement. That letter was his voice. The rest is legal fact. Wilde frowned. Isn't it possible that your husband simply changed his mind and failed to update the paperwork? It's possible, Elaine said. But unlikely. He was an engineer. He believed in systems. In signatures. That's why he wrote down everything. She paused, then added, and if he had changed his mind, if he had wanted to remove me, he would have. He never did. Bradley did that, after the fact. Gasps flickered at the back of the room. Wilde stepped back. No further questions. Judge Lowenthal turned to Elaine. You may speak briefly, if there's anything you wish to add. Elaine nodded. She looked toward the judge, then, slowly, toward Bradley. When I met Bradley, he was 12. I helped him with his math homework. Took him to practice. I loved him like my own. And when the business grew, I included him. I wanted him to succeed. She looked down, then back up. What I never expected was to be erased. Not just from the company, but from the history. from the narrative. Her voice tightened, but she didn't waver. I'm not here because of money. I'm here because truth matters. Because history matters. Because women who build things, who stay late, who stay quiet, deserve not to be written out when it's convenient. She folded her hands again. This company has many fingerprints on it. But mine are there from the beginning. You can trace them in the margins, in the numbers, in the structure. That's all I've ever asked, not to be given credit I didn't earn, but not to have it taken from me when I did. The room was still. Judge Lowenthal sat back, thoughtful. We'll reconvene next week for closing statements. Elaine stood, calmly gathered her things, and stepped down from the witness stand. Bradley didn't look at her. She didn't need him to, because everyone else had. The day of the verdict dawned cool and overcast, a rare quiet morning in Los Angeles. From her apartment window, Elaine watched a line of birds cut across the sky, just above the low haze that blanketed the city. She didn't eat breakfast. Just brewed coffee and stood silently at her sink, letting the weight of the month settle into stillness. There was nothing else to prepare. The courtroom was nearly full by the time she arrived. Familiar faces. Company executives. A handful of press. Even Danielle, the young accountant who had spoken out, sat in the back row in a simple blazer, hands folded tightly in her lap. Elaine gave her the smallest nod. Danielle returned it, eyes steady. Judge Lowenthal entered at exactly 9:00 a.m. Please be seated. Elaine sat. Bradley, across the aisle, wore a navy suit and a closed expression. His attorney, Wild, looked resigned. His hands were empty, no folders, no notes. Just a silence that seemed heavier than any argument. The judge adjusted her glasses. This court has reviewed all submitted documentation, deposition transcripts, testimony, and financial exhibits. The matter before us concerns rightful ownership, fiduciary responsibility, and the role of original shareholder agreements in determining legal standing. Elaine did not shift in her seat. In reviewing the founding documents from 1993, this court finds them to be authentic, properly notarized, and legally binding. No subsequent filings or corporate actions effectively voided those agreements. Therefore, the court affirms that Elaine Gutierrez is the majority shareholder of G&G Tech Systems. A quiet gasp echoed behind her. She heard it, but her focus never wavered. The judge continued. Furthermore, the court finds credible evidence of sustained fiduciary breaches carried out by Mr. Bradley Gutierrez through unauthorized vendor payments and concealment of self-dealing arrangements. While criminal proceedings fall outside the jurisdiction of this court, the findings will be referred to the appropriate authorities for investigation. Bradley's face paled. His jaw locked. Judge Lowenthal concluded, voice clear and final, the plaintiff's request for sole ownership is denied. The court hereby reinstates Elaine Gutierrez as legal majority shareholder and recognizes her authority to direct the company's executive structure effective immediately. The gavel struck once the court adjourned. Elaine remained seated for a moment, not from hesitation, but from reverence. The words she had fought so hard to prove were now public record. Not whispered behind doors. Not buried in dusty files. Spoken aloud. Entered into the system. Permanent. She stood and turned. Susan Leung was already on her feet, walking toward her. Behind her, Kenneth Duvall. And farther back, even a few board members Elaine barely knew, people who'd never once addressed her during Bradley's reign, now looking directly at her. No fanfare. No applause, just something quieter, recognition. She walked out into the courtyard, where the gray sky had begun to lift. Reporters clustered near the entrance. Lauren Cho from the Herald stood at the front, recorder in hand. Elaine paused. Would you like to make a statement? Lauren asked gently. Elaine considered it. For a moment, then, I already did, she said with a small smile. In court. Lauren nodded, respecting the answer. Elaine stepped past them and kept walking. Not hurried. Not triumphant. Just whole. That evening, in the silence of her apartment, Elaine opened the box one last time. The original shareholder agreement. The trust letter. Javier's note. She slid them back into their protective sleeves, not to hide them, but to preserve them. For the next time someone asked who built the company. Who kept it running? Who refused to let the truth be forgotten? And maybe, someday, someone would open the box and find more than contracts. Maybe they'd find her story, not one of revenge or of conflict, but of endurance. Of memory. Of a woman who built quietly, lost loudly, and reclaimed it all with the calm power of a paper trail no one could tear down.